Last spring, I had the opportunity to do an early field experience at a small rural school in Southwest Virginia. Each week, I formulated a research question that I could personally test through observations and teacher interviews. This presentation focuses on the National Council of Teachers of Mathematics Principle of Equity. The NCTM Equity Principle states that excellence in mathematics education requires equity, which is high expectations and strong support for all students. First, all students, regardless of their personal characteristics, backgrounds, or physical challenges, must have opportunities to study and support to learn mathematics. Next, students with special learning needs in mathematics should be supported by both their classroom teachers and special education staff. Likewise, students with special interests or exceptional talent in mathematics may need enrichment programs or additional resources to keep them challenged and engaged. The talent and interest of these students must be nurtured so that they have the opportunity and guidance to excel in mathematics. Finally, well-documented examples demonstrate that all children can learn mathematics when they have access to high-quality mathematics instruction. Such instruction needs to become the norm rather than the expectation. So once again, I was at a small rural school in Southwest Virginia. For privacy reasons, I will refer to my mentor teacher by the pseudonym of Mrs. Becker. I was able to observe 3 class periods, Algebra 1, Algebra 2, and NRCC Math. NRCC stands for New River Community College, and this is a class in which seniors in high school can earn college credit through New River Community College. And I observed students through the 8th grade through the 12th grade. So my research question was stimulated when Mrs. Becker told me that she lets her students choose their seats at the beginning of the year. So my research question therefore asks, is there an identifiable bias that Mrs. Becker makes when calling on a student given where they're sitting in a classroom? So the first article I read to support this focused on group work. It was called Keys to Successful Group Work: Culture, Structure, Nurture. So there was 3 key elements in which group work would succeed. The first would be that classroom culture supports collaboration and teamwork. The second would be structure for groups and tasks. So at all times, students need to have a task to be working on. And finally, strategies that nurture the work throughout the year. So students should really be relying on one another to ask questions instead of going straight to the teacher. So group work can become a cornerstone if it's well implemented. The second article I read was called Equity in the Classroom. Students deserve schools that are intelligent and equitable by design, schools which assure access to knowledge and which have the creativity and flexibility to give students the additional resources they need to attain that knowledge. So this article focuses on the idea of tracking, which is dividing students into groups based on their perceived ability or prior achievement. While this has certain benefits, more than 700 studies in the past 50 years, and a majority of research says not to do it because tracking doesn't achieve any of these goals in reality. So they provide 2 alternatives. The first would be heterogeneous grouping, which engages all levels of students, and the second would be differentiated instruction, which engages all types of learners. The final article I read was called Promoting Equity in Mathematics: One Teacher's Journey. So reasonable and appropriate accommodations need to be made as needed to promote access to challenging mathematical ideas for all students. So this article followed up with the idea of tracking, but it traced one teacher's personal journey. He taught at a high school in Albuquerque, New Mexico, where tracking was the method that the school system used to track progress. In 1997, he convinced the administration to pilot heterogeneous learning and new curriculum and saw multiple benefits from this. So going back to my research question, just a reminder, it was, is there any identifiable bias that Mrs. Becker makes when calling on a student given where they're sitting in a classroom? So the methods I used were observation and teacher interviews. So the observation, I only observed the first 2 class periods, so that would have been Algebra 1 and Algebra 2. And then for my teacher interview, I asked Mrs. Becker 4 questions. The first was, do you use a seating chart for any of your classes? She said that she lets the students choose their seats at the beginning of the year, and that becomes their seating chart. She warns them, though, that she will move them if any other talking or distractions do become a problem. The next question I asked was, have you ever had to adjust a seating chart due to student behavior or other issues? Almost every year, Mrs. Becker has had to make an adjustment due to these issues with student behavior, but ironically, this is the first year that she has not had to make any adjustments. The third question asked was, do you follow a certain procedure when calling on your students to answer a mathematics question? The overall answer was no, but Mrs. Becker did say that she prefers to call on students that are less likely to speak up in class, students that have been struggling, or students that are younger than the rest of the class. So for instance, having an 8th grader in an Algebra 2 class that's primarily juniors. And the final question was, do you find that specifically calling on students is more beneficial than generally asking the class? She said that there's an even balance, and she likes generally asking the class because she feels that it runs smoother, but she does like to hold her students accountable and expects that they answer when specifically called upon. So this was a diagram of first period algebra. As you can see, the squares represent desks. The white squares represent desks that were unoccupied that day. The orange squares represent desks in which students left the class to go to SOL testing, so they were not present for the class period. And the green squares represent desks that were occupied. Additionally, the stars represented in each of the green squares represent how many times the student was called on. You can also see how I compared the front of the class to the back of the class, given the black dotted line. So total, there were 14 out of 26 desks occupied in this first period algebra class. The results are as follows. From the front of the room, at least once being called upon, there was 8 out of 8 students. There were 7 out of 8 students called on at least twice, and there were 3 out of 8 students called on at least 3 times or more. Comparing that to the back of the room, 6 out of 6 students were called on at least once, 5 out of 6 students were called on at least twice, and 2 out of 6 students were called on 3 times or more. So the percentages that evaluate what these numbers are on the right column, and as you can see, they line up pretty equally, and so Mrs. Becker was pretty consistent. Looking at the Algebra 2 second period class, once again the squares represent the same thing, so white squares represent unoccupied desks, and green squares represent occupied desks, where the stars represent how many times that particular student was called upon. So the results for this are as follows. In the front of the room, 10 out of 10 students were called on at least once, 5 out of 10 students were called on at least twice, and no students were called on 3 times or more. For the back of the room, 8 out of 8 students were called on at least once, 5 out of 8 students were called on at least twice, and 0 students were called on 3 times or more. So once again, the percentages are listed in the columns on the right, and once again, they are pretty consistent between the back of the room and the front of the room. So my conclusions are that there's no identifiable bias made when calling on students based on where they're sitting in Mrs. Becker's classroom. In both classes, Mrs. Becker called on each student 100% of the time, regardless of where they were sitting. The times Mrs. Becker called on a particular student at least twice ranged from 50% to 87.5% across both classes. And the times she called on a particular student in either the front or the back 3 times or more ranged from 0% to 37.5%. So overall, I concluded that she does not make an identifiable bias when calling on students. These would be my references. Thank you very much.